Well, there's an organization in Bonn which tracks military expenditures not only as a proportion of GDP, but also in comparison to health and education expenditures. And also they calculate the proportion of the manpower of any given country which are in the military or security services. This is called the Global Militarization Index. By this index, the Middle East and North Africa, since 1990, have been the most militarized, has been the most militarized region of the world, and that its accelerated pace of militarization took off in 2010, 2011, at the time of the Arab uprising, and it continues to develop. So here's a region which is facing economic hard times for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is the decline of oil and gas prices, which is spending more and more on the military, not only absolutely, but also as a proportion of their budgets. So this is a country where the guns are triumphing over the butter, and the growth of the militaries in these various countries, in various forms, state militaries, militias, and so on, is further undermining their prospects for development and undermining the prospects for political reconciliation. So militarization is a very dangerous phenomenon in this region, being supported by both domestic factors and by external factors. The biggest change is probably in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries of the Arabian Peninsula. They are now basically the world's biggest spenders on the military. Saudi Arabia is the fourth biggest spender in the world, and the Emirates is just behind at number 5. Now these are countries, the Emirates probably has a total domestic population, a native population, of just over 1 million people. So it's hugely disproportionate to the population base and indeed to the resource base of these countries. You can also say Kuwait has reintroduced conscription. Bahrain is another country in which conscription has been reinstated. So these are countries that are spending huge amounts on the military and are drafting more of their populations into their militaries, and which are adding more and more mercenaries to their military forces. So here are countries that have relatively small population, native population bases, but which are in the world's leading ranks of spenders on the military, and now in world leading ranks in the size of their militaries. So this is a very dangerous situation, not only for the Arabian Peninsula itself, but for the entire region. Once you create a military, the tendency is to want to use it, and that's what's going on. They're intervening in various parts of the region. Yemen, Syria, Libya are cases in point. They're both regional and domestic threats, and maybe about evenly balanced, in fact. That militarization is a process also of asserting control over the domestic body politic, maybe most notably in a country like Egypt, where the military has seized power and is using its, the further building of its military muscle to directly and indirectly subdue the population. So in some countries, the domestic calculation is more important than the regional threat calculation. Now, in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, competition with Iran is, of course, a driving force. But so, too, in those countries is the desire of certain actors within the royal families to assert their power by virtue of controlling a military that is expanding. So we have relatively young leaders in Abu Dhabi, for example, and now increasingly in Saudi Arabia, who are flexing their muscles within the context of their own families and their own body politics by building up military capacity. So I think in all cases, this domestic factor of asserting control from the top down is very important in the militarization. Now, there are regional conflicts raging right across the Middle East and North Africa. But the sorts of weapons acquisitions that are going on, especially in Saudi Arabia, they're very high-tech, satellite, now increasing use of satellite reconnaissance, satellite-controlled fire systems and so on. This is far beyond the level of threat that is originating from Iran or indeed from any other quarter. And so it tends to be more sort of the, it's called the Jaynes phenomenon of looking good on paper. You look very powerful on paper, sort of a muscular sort of thing of that sort. And I think that's a very, very big part of it. If they wanted to actually confront more effectively the threat from Iran, they would be building up their asymmetric capacities to match those that Iran itself is engaged in. But that they have not been at all effective in doing. Witness the case in Syria, witness the case in Yemen. The biggest seller is the United States. It is far and away the world's largest purveyor of arms. It is followed by European countries and Russia. And increasingly China is number 5 or number 6 now. So it is basically the Western countries, Russia and China. Then a series of smaller suppliers, Canada, Australia, Brazil, and so on, are in it. This is the world's biggest arms market. If you are an arms manufacturer and you are not selling into the Middle East and North Africa, then you are way behind, because no other region is acquiring arms in the magnitude that the Middle East and North Africa is. Well, you're suggesting there's a contradiction on the one hand of wanting to sell arms and on the other hand trying to mediate conflicts. Not an apparent, it's not a desired contradiction. That is to say that I think the capitals of Washington, Paris, London, and so on aren't wanting to stoke, if you will, the conflicts that are there. They would like to reduce them, but at the same time, they have two good reasons to sell arms. One, they're supporting their domestic arms manufacturers and spreading the costs of that manufacture over a greater number of buyers. But secondly, they believe that the militaries are the dominant actors in these countries. That if you are not connected to those militaries, you will have marginal influence in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, in Algeria and Morocco and so on. And so your way of gaining access and influence in those countries is through military and the delivery of military weapons. I think this is a misguided idea, but that is a very prominent way of thinking, certainly in Washington and in other capitals. So the idea is, okay, you sell arms, you're supporting your domestic manufacturers, you are gaining influence in the capitals where the arms are being purchased, and that in turn will enable you to then have influence over regional events, right? That you can use your influence to try to resolve conflicts, let's say between Saudi Arabia and Iran, or between different factions in Iraq, for example. But since we have yet to see that happen, since we have yet to see an effective engagement from the outside world into resolving these conflicts that are raging in the Middle East and North Africa, you have to discount this idea that it is not borne fruition, that the stoking of the conflicts by provision of arms has not been translated then into the sort of influence that would enable outside actors to reduce the levels of tension and conflict. It is simply increase them. So I think it's more wishful thinking on the part of Western capitals, and I'm not sure, I can't speak for what the Russians think in terms of the influence given by their provision of arms, or the Chinese, but I think it's wishful thinking in the West that the provision of arms is going to give them influence, and that influence in turn will reduce those conflicts. This has not happened, at least as yet. Not since Nasser in the period 1954 through the Six-Day War of 1967 has the military played such an enormously important role in the social, economic, and political life of that country. And we can chart it by its further intervention into the economy. So the military is controlling an ever greater proportion of that economy. The military is controlling an ever greater proportion of the legal judicial system. The military is controlling its own prisons now, in which civilians are held. The military has now 80 of the members of the almost 600-strong parliament are former officers. The entire system of local government in Egypt is now staffed by former serving military officers. So this is a country, it's called an officer republic, to use one of the terms that is applied to it. This is something that is most unusual in the contemporary world. In other military dictatorships, the degree of military control has not reached that which it has under Sisi in Egypt. And the key instrument that he uses for this is military intelligence, which was the organization within the military in which he served for the longest period of time and was the basis for his taking power within the military. Before then, he staged the coup d'etat against President Morsi in July of 2013. So within military rule is a military intelligence apparatus that is first and foremost responsible for monitoring the military, and secondarily and increasingly, and something that's very unusual in its history, for monitoring the behavior of civilians. So military intelligence is now running its own system of arrest, imprisonment, torture, and so on. This is altogether a new development in Egypt, and it's a very frightening one. We witnessed the case of Giulio Regeni, which attests to the fact that we have now a completely out of control system of coercion connected to the very president himself. And this is a very, very dangerous thing, and it should not be supported in any way, shape, or form by the governments of the West.